Good morning. Good to see you all. And again, happy Father's Day. As with any of these days, there's a spectrum of people who experience these days in different ways. And so, as Mike prayed, happy Father's Day to those of you who feel joy and gratitude as a father or for your father, and those of us who miss our dads. For those of us who have other challenging stories related to this day, may God comfort you. I want to conclude our series today on grace, and the title is Grace Abounds. Last week, we talked about how human nature is not just a tame problem, it's not just a complicated problem, but it really is something that's called a wicked problem. And if you Wikipedia this or something, you'll learn that tame problems are problems that can be solved in a linear fashion. You do A, B, and C, and then the problem is solved. Complicated problems are more intricate, more interconnected. There's some more information that you need. There's case scenarios and such. And so, like building a dam, is a complicated problem. You have to divert the river, think about the impact of that, and then plan it out. So it can take 20 years to build a dam, right? So it can be solved. But then there are problems like poverty. You'll see that that's a common example of a wicked problem. It has never been solved. It has always existed and it will always exist, is what it seems like. Remember, Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. Maybe he knew that someday in 2021, Peter would talk about wicked problems. And he said, when he's talking about it, poverty will still exist. And he said, the poor you'll always have with you. Nobody's ever been able to solve it. Any country you put your finger on, they have poverty. It's a wicked problem. And at the core of wicked problems, I think, is something that I think of as human nature. And the question I want to ask today is, what's the solution? And from a human perspective, maybe there are categories of problems, but from God's perspective, do these categories exist? Like, does God have tame problems that he feels relief about because he can solve them easily? And then he has complicated ones where he has to scratch his head a few times, but it can be done. And then wicked problems where he just shrugs his shoulders and just says, you know what, let it go on forever. The poor will always exist. What can I do about it? What's God's view of human nature? Can he, God himself, solve the wickedest of all problems? A story. And I think I have more car stories than I really should. I don't have a lot of problems driving, especially as I get older. I've matured a little bit, and I have a different view of, my rights as a driver than I used to when I was younger. But this happened kind of recently, so it shows you I'm not as mature as I like to think I am. I was trying to park in a supermarket parking lot, and it's got those diagonal parking spots where they're sort of one-way rows, right? And you have to go in, and then you sort of half turn into these parking lots. Sometimes those are double-sided angles, so it's a two-way lane, or sometimes it's a one-way lane. Anyways, I was going down one of these one-lane parking rows where you have to pull into the parking lot, but I had come the wrong way. And then I thought, I'll just back into it, right? Because you can't make too hard of a turn and get into it at the right angle, right? And you have to kind of back out and do one of those, multi-step maneuver. I don't want to do that. I thought I'd pull up and then back into it. But then there was a car on the other side who decided to pull into it, but from the other side, because both of those spots are empty. And so it turns out that she had to park in the spot I was trying to back into, and not the spot she was passing over to get into the spot I was trying to get into. You guys seeing this in your minds? Now, she's about halfway into my spot. I call it mine already. You understand the problem already? I already feel like it's mine. I have possession over it. And there we are at a stalemate. I look back And she's looking forward, and we're staring at each other. Nobody's budging. At that moment, I was really embarrassed that I was actually in the wrong, but she's kind of in the wrong too. She's not supposed to pull into that spot, and I'm not supposed to back into that spot, right? I wished I wasn't Asian at that moment. Why, whenever I'm in a bad driving situation, do I have to be Asian? I thought, I'm just not helping the stereotype here. Um, and then she gets out of her car, and she starts yelling at me. And then she gets racist on me. She tells me to go back to where I came from. I know. My blood instantly goes from normal to boil. You know how that is. And I just think, what if she comes to my church though? Like, never know. I don't know half the people that show up on a Sunday. And so I thought, I better not do this. It's a small place, small city, only 20,000 people. I got to behave here, right? And so I do the thing that I should have not done in the first place, and I pull out of the spot and I go find another spot, and I move on with my life. But clearly, I'm still thinking about it because I'm telling this story today, 2 years later, right? Now, I went home and I started thinking about this. If I wanted to, quote unquote, help this woman, what would I do? What recourse do I have? How would you go about solving the problem of the woman who gets out of the car when both of us are in the wrong, and she starts yelling at me, getting really upset, and eventually plays the racist card? How would you help her? So I started thinking about what might be underneath the surface of her life. Like, what kind of day does she have? Now you have to think about her day, the context to that moment. And then I started thinking about her week. What kind of week does she have? And then I started thinking, well, what kind of marriage does she have? And she looked like she was maybe in her 40s, maybe early 50s. And I thought, what kind of marriage, life? Does her husband love her? Do her kids like her? Maybe her kids hate her. Maybe they don't let her see her grandkids. Maybe she's had a falling out. Maybe she's divorced. Maybe her parents mistreated her. Maybe she's a victim of something. Like, I have no idea. So in that moment, we are confronted by the situation, but really the situation is symptomatic. It's not the cause. Right? There's a lot that had to have been true about her and about me for us to have that encounter. And so if I wanted to sort of, quote unquote, fix her or help her, I would have to start way back. We'd have to have many conversations. And it's not a given that conversations would actually help her. Maybe she's been to therapy. Maybe she has a pastor. Maybe she's read books. Maybe kids have sat her down and had interventions. I have no idea. But I know that I don't know where to start if I try to solve the problem of her. Like, what's really going on in her life? No idea. Where would you start? What would you do if I hired you and I said, here's $5,000. You have a month to fix her. At least help her to click forward a little bit so that she doesn't do that anymore. Help her not to play the race card. What would you do? Where would you start? Can you control her? Can you force her? Can you plead with her? Can you nag her? What would you do? What's your plan A, B, plan C? Have you ever been in a position of pleading and wanting something the other person? Have you ever been in a situation, maybe with a spouse or a child or a family member, where you want them to want something that they don't want for themselves? Have you ever looked at someone and you knew exactly what they needed, but they refused to see it the way you see it? But you love them. and you want this for them, you want better, you want the best for them, what would you do? What power do you have? What influence? What control? Would you ultimately resort to force? Do you have to overtake their will? Would you get so frustrated and then abandon them? What would you do? What could you do? If you've ever been in this kind of position, and I think at this stage of the game, for most of us, maybe all of us, we know it's a losing battle. It's just about impossible to forcefully change somebody else. You can't make them want something that they don't want for themselves. It's an impossible position to be in for you and for them. Force, manipulation, coercion, nagging, pleading, none of this works. And sometimes we oscillate back and forth on this constant pendulum swing, trying to be Messiah, trying to be manager. What would you do with the wicked problems of your life? Most of you may remember this movie, Matrix. I recently watched it, and I finally understand what the movie's about. I get it now. And really the answer to what the movie's about happens when Neo is in the final scene and he's having a conversation with the architect. And the architect explains that Neo is not the first Messiah figure in the Matrix, that there's been many Neos who've tried to save the people. Every time they fail, every time their behavior was. Neo is interesting because he is able to break out of that pattern and solve a wicked problem, the wicked problem of human nature, in a way that no other Neos have been able to solve before. And some of you, probably most of you, don't remember what the difference was. But what Neo did was he sacrificed himself, and nobody else had sacrificed before. Remember, Trinity died for him? So the answer, according to the Matrix, is the way you solve wicked problems is through sacrifice. That's the message of the story. So for the rest of the sermon today, I want to try to answer this question, how God goes about solving the wicked problem of human nature. And it's not too different from the Matrix, as it turns out. Okay. So we have just two verses we want to start with. Romans chapter 5, verse 20, and then a little bit further down, Romans 6, chapter 6, verse 1. 5:20 says this, now the law came to increase the trespass. God's beginning to address human nature here. The law came in to increase the trespass, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. So this is part one of God's solution to the wicked problem of human nature. God does something to not decrease sin, but actually increase it. So the law comes in. God gives us the law, not so that we're actually sinning more initially, but so that we're able to see that what we're doing is actually wrong. So you kind of estimate the distance. I think that's about 6 feet. Well, how do you know? I don't know. Are you wrong? Are you right? Nobody knows. But then God gives a ruler, a tape measure, and suddenly you see exactly by how much you're off. So that's the function of the law that came in to increase the sin. Right? It's kind of not actually increasing it, but there's a secondary effect that the law has. Just the fact that now you have a tape measure makes you want to violate the tape measure. Now you want to create distances and tell people that it's actually a certain distance just to see if you can get away with it, just so you can assert your own autonomy, just because that's your nature. You don't want to be ruled. You don't want to be controlled. right? It's called emotional friction. If one person pushes this way, you have to push back with an equal and opposite force. That's how human interactions go. If you don't believe me, try to control me. I will push back in some way because I can't have you erase me. I still want to exist. I don't want you to define me. I don't want you to tell me what I am or who I am. I want to have some say-so in the matter, right? So there's two functions of the law: to show you just by how much you're sinning, and also to reveal to you the nature that makes you actually deliberately want to break the law. So the law came in to increase in that twofold way, the sin. But here's God's response to our response to the law. Where sin increased, what? Grace abounded all the more. So this is God's strategy. To not punish us when sin increases, but to actually forgive us more, to bless more, to love more, to pursue more. Isn't that amazing? See, I think it's amazing because my human nature is really sensitive to being taken advantage of. I mean, I'm a dad. I have 4 kids, right? And basically, the story of fatherhood and parenthood has been trying to walk this fine line between, loving my kids and controlling my kids and not spoiling my kids. Like this is the fine art, the science and art of being a dad. How? I mean, I'm an immigrant. I wasn't born here, right? I lived in a basement apartment in Flushing, New York, roach infested, rat infested. Apartment number LG. That's where I grew up, playing by myself in the side yard of the apartment building in the dirt. I remember this. Roller skating around the sidewalk with my friends, playing with firecrackers on 4th of July, running to the store and buying 25-cent chips. I grew up like this, and I want my kids to have more and better. Like, my goodness, my 11-year-old had tennis lessons yesterday for the first time in her life. I didn't even know tennis lessons were a thing. Like, nobody got lessons for anything. Like, that's not a luxury I had. But now she thinks it's normal to get lessons to play tennis. Like, what kind of world is she growing up in? Right? Is she spoiled? And now she feels entitled to lessons? So this is it. You got to do this dance with human nature. The law came in to increase the trespass, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. And so this immediately brings up Romans 6:1. And this is coming up in our minds. What shall we say then? If 5:20 is true, then 6:1 absolutely has to come into play. Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? Absolutely the appropriate question. This is human nature. Wait a minute. If I do A, and that means I get B, and I like B, you have to do more of A to get more of B. It's not rocket science. I literally know it's not, because they've tested this with rats, for example, right? To test the gambling theory, they've done this where rats who pressed a certain lever a certain number of times, got certain kind of treats, they would do this. They understood cause and effect. You press lever A, and then you get reward B. And then they had another subset of rats where the lever was inconsistent, the number of times you press it. Sometimes you pressed it once, and you got a treat. Sometimes it was 5 times, and you got a treat. And sometimes you never got anything, no matter how many times you pressed it. And you know what these rats did? they die pressing that lever. Because they understand cause and effect. What shall we say? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? Why are you here at church today? I don't know about you, but I do get superstitious. I wonder, I know my religious behavior doesn't amount to, as they say, a hill of beans. I don't know what that means. It doesn't amount to anything. And yet, if I don't go, if I skip too many Sundays, I begin to feel like, that flat tire, was that kind of a cause and effect thing? If I don't tithe, or if I cheat on my tithing, then is Uncle Sam going to get me this year? You start playing mind games because we're grasping at control. We're trying to know what the levers are. Very appropriate. Should we sin more that grace may abound all the more? But here's the incorrect assumption that this question, 6:1, is built on. The assumption is that there is this undeserving person who will always be undeserving. And they have this wicked problem called human nature that defines how they behave, how they think, how they react to life, right? And the assumption is that they experience grace, and this grace is effective in their life. And because of their experience of God's grace, they love it so much, they actually want more grace. And that's the reason that they're going to go back to lever A, is because they loved outcome B so much. That's the assumption. But is that what's happening here? Well, we have Romans 6:2, Paul's answer to this question. Paul says, may it never be. Now, if you, and you can do this now with our modern day technology, before you had to go into books and things like that and go to school, but now you can just search this up on Google. The phrase may never be in the Greek, it's a kind of a tricky translation. It's a rhetorical device. May it never be is a way of expressing, not may it never be like it shouldn't be, but it's more forceful than that. What Paul is saying is, it can never be. He is saying, that's not the way that works. Your assumption is wrong. Your question, as valid as it seems, should we sin more that grace may abound all the more, is actually built on the wrong assumption. It cannot be. It doesn't work that way. Asking the question, should we sin more, is evidence, Paul is saying, that grace has not been effective in the question asker's life in the first place. The person asking that question, should we sin more that grace may abound all the more, isn't actually somebody who has tasted of grace and then wants more of that, and then is trying to figure out how to get more of that. What the person that's asking that question, this person is not after grace, but this person is actually after the opposite of grace. They're after works. They're after entitlement. They're after their own power, their own ego. They want to know not how can I lose control because of the sheer undeserving nature and the way grace makes me the recipient as an undeserving person. That's not what this person is. This person is saying, I had control. I tasted of my own power. When I do A, I get more of B. Therefore, I can be more in control because now I have contact with lever A. Lever A is mine. This is my precious. I want this thing. I want to be able to rub this lamp and have access, control over my genie. You understand? That's why Paul is saying, may it never be. It cannot be. A person who has actually experienced grace as grace doesn't want more control. They actually want to turn over control. Their problem is beginning to get solved by grace. So if you find yourself in a position where you are asking that question, then you have to go back further into the story, the equation, and recognize the fact that you are asking that question means you actually haven't experienced grace. You've experienced maybe a reward, maybe a payout, a paycheck, something you deserved in the first place, which means it wasn't grace to you. Because there's something in you that thinks you deserved it somehow, that you have control, that you did something to cause it. Listen, if you play the lotto and you win $1 million, you know it was luck, but you also think, well, maybe it's not just luck. Maybe I had something to do with it. Well, I did buy that ticket. When did I buy it? It was on my birthday. I'm going to buy a ticket every year on my birthday. And the numbers I played, it was a combination of all of the birthdays, months, and years of my family. So I'm going to keep playing a combination of these numbers on my birthday every year. What are you doing when you do that? You're not fully understanding that when you won the lotto last year, it was completely luck. But there's the wickedness in you that makes you think, I controlled it, I influenced it, I had some say-so in the matter. So it makes you think, let me do more of A so I can get more of B. Here's how that works. Just when it seems unfair to God, that's grace's starting point in your life. Just when you feel like you're taking advantage of God's grace, that's grace's starting point for you. As long as you think you deserve it, as long as you think it's fair, then you're still playing this ridiculous game. You're still trying to buy lotto tickets on your birthday. I'll give you an example from my life. 3 times I undertook 30-day fasts. And I have this long history with fasting. It's kind of like a game I play with God, my Christian life. And so I've done a ton of one-day fasts. I know you're doing a fast. So I don't mean to. I don't want to taint your experience of that. But here's my experience. When I fasted for one day, my conclusion at the end of every day of fasting is fasting doesn't work. Because all I had was bad breath, all I felt was hunger, and all I thought about was food. I didn't pray more. It didn't make me feel anything that was spiritual by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I felt more human than ever. Not spiritual, more fleshly. It's my conclusion after fasting for one day. So I kind of gave up on one-day fast. And so then I went through this bout where I just did 3-day fast. And by the 3rd day, I felt amazing. I felt like I prayed more. I felt more connected to the spiritual world. I actually felt more superior than other human beings who were eating. I did. I just, you know how you feel when you wake up early? By the time everybody else wakes up, you've done like all the things already. You kind of feel superior, right? That's how I felt, but like more extremely so. I can't believe you're eating. You're such a loser. Right? And then if anybody ever talked to me about a problem they had, you know what my recommended solution was every time? You got to fast, not just one day. But I had a formula. I know how lever A works, right? 3 days, not 2, not 1, 3. 3 days you fast, and you too can be like me. That's the idea, right? But you know what happened when I fasted for 30 days? Like, I did not recommend fasting to anyone. In fact, I wasn't even thinking about fasting anymore. I was a complete wreck. See, here's what I learned about fasting when I fasted for longer than 3 days was fasting is not this thing that you do, but fasting is something that's bigger than you, that you enter into, and it begins to do you. See, that's the same thing with anything that's worth doing. Marriage, you go into it thinking we're the exception to every rule, every couple that's ever walked the face of the earth. We're going to do things and be things and accomplish things that no other couple has ever done because our love, for once, it's real, unlike these couples around here, right? That's how you go into it, with that kind of naivete and arrogance. But then as you live in that marriage, you begin to experience some struggles and challenges. And at some point you realize you're not doing marriage. Marriage is doing you. It's bigger than you. Its force is greater than you. And it begins to mold and shape you. So whatever arrogance you brought into the marriage, it begins to destroy that too. And pretty soon you're humbled by marriage. In fact, more than half the marriages end in divorce. I was reading recently that in South Korea, we have the highest divorce rates maybe in the world, over 60% now. Increasing number of divorces initiated by women now. It's a thing. Marriage is hard. And so this is the experience with grace. If you have just a little bit of grace, your conclusion will be it doesn't work. Human nature is too powerful. But if you experience just enough grace, you know what your conclusion will be? I got this. I know how grace works. Let me show you how to work the levers. And you become legalistic and arrogant and manipulative in the way you talk about and dole out and experience grace. But when you have too much grace, if you actually have abounding grace in your life, then you realize grace is not something that you maintain control over, but is something that completely wrecks your life and begins to solve your wicked problem. And it overtakes you. You enter into it, and it has a power over you. You don't play the levers anymore. It's no cause and effect. It's not A, then B. But it's, I don't know. I don't know how this works. And then finally, it begins to break you down. May it never be. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? This is the way grace works. It kills you such that your nature begins to die and a new nature begins to be born. This is God's solution. I want to begin our closing here. I had a pastor that inspired me to come into the ministry. Just like a lot of Asian immigrant children, I was told by my mother that it was God's will for me to become a doctor. And so I went to college planning to be a doctor, majored in biology. And then freshman year, I heard this preacher Mike, preaching on what we call the DIAC. That was the center campus on the outside at the University of Michigan. And third year, my junior year at the college, I learned that there were some money shenanigans happening, and he and one elder were kind of in cahoots with something. And he had been having this affair for 2 years, and it all came out, and it was just this messy, ugly thing. But I was really close to him. He was quite an inspiration to me. And so after I became a pastor, and years after he was in recovery, and he and his family were back together, and so I invited him out to be a speaker at a retreat, and I was driving him around, and Mike tells me this story. And he says, Peter, after everything was happening, I had this multiple bypass surgery, and I was in the hospital on my bed, and I had this dream thing happen. And he said, I want to tell you about it because it's this dream that I come back to that's been saving me every single day. Because so many times I've wanted to kill myself. I wanted to just leave life and just leave ministry and everything, just give up on the whole thing. So disappointed in myself. I'm just a loser. I'm a failure, not worth living. And my kids, my wife, my community, just so bad. Nothing else, nowhere to turn, right? And so he said, but I had this dream once in the hospital. And this dream is recurring, not recurring as a dream, but I just keep thinking about it. So he said this was his dream. In the dream, there is a tree. And God says to him, Mike, climb that tree. So he climbs a tree. And then God says, Mike, go out on the limb. So Mike goes way out on a big branch. And then God hands him a saw and says, Mike, start cutting. And Mike pauses and won't cut the limb. And God says, Mike, cut the limb, won't cut it. And the third time, God says, Mike, cut the limb. So then, out of obedience, he starts cutting the limb that he's sitting on. And he's really scared. Any moment now, he's going to fall, collapse, and die. And then there's one more cut left in his vision. He knows there's one more motion, and the limb is off. He makes a final cut, and then instead of the limb falling to the earth, the tree falls down. And then God says, Mike, what's been holding you up? And that's his whole dream. That's it. The story ends right there. It wasn't the tree. It wasn't the laws of nature holding him up. It was God all along. And he says, Peter, I know I got nothing holding me up right now except God, but it was God all along. It wasn't those things. It wasn't my reputation. It wasn't my credibility. It wasn't my morality. It wasn't my unresolved issues. It wasn't my broken marriage. It wasn't my secrecy. It wasn't any of, lack of secrecy. It wasn't any of those things that was upholding my life. It was God. And I finally learned this lesson through my abject failure. That's what he said. I don't know what it's going to take for us to learn that it's all by God's grace. But until then, we're going to keep playing this game. We're going to keep thinking we have control. We're going to keep thinking we deserve it. We're going to keep playing the levers. But God still maintains where sin increases, grace will abound all the more, because that's his strategy. That's his solution. So as we close here, I want us to close by reading this passage. This is from John chapter 1. And this word logos hopefully has some meaning to you. It's the name of your church. It's an interesting word. It's a word that's hard to translate. And many scholars and preachers have tried to translate this. Some say that it's our word for logic. And obviously, the word logic comes from this word. Some say it's the word for meaning. Some say it's the word for truth. Most will say it's kind of a combination of those kinds of words. It's like the reason, the logic, the truth, the integrity, the strategy of God here, right? And that's translated as the word by a lot of translators. So I'm going to read this passage 2 times. I'm going to read it first time the way it is written. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came into his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word, Logos, became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Okay, so we know from this passage that this word Logos, it's kind of a placeholder, interchangeable with Jesus, right? Because the Logos became Christ. That's what it says, became flesh. And this Jesus, which is Logos, was full of this thing called grace and truth. And so this grace and truth, this person, Jesus, this Logos, this word, created the world. Everything that exists came through him. It's an expression of him. So everything is grace. There's nothing that exists that doesn't come from him, right? And this word, this Logos, is God, was God, is God, and became God in the flesh. So it's kind of this, you have to kind of have a non-binary mindset. You can't have a Western binary mindset. You have to have more of an Eastern mindset to understand this kind of mystery. But let me read it with some words substituted out. So just listen here. In the beginning was this logic of grace and truth, this strategy of God, this reason of, right? In the beginning was this grace of God. And this grace strategy, this grace logic was with God. And this grace logic was God. And this grace logic was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through this grace logic, through this grace strategy, this abounding grace strategy. And apart from this abounding grace logic, nothing came into being that has come into being. And in this grace and truth logic was life. And the life was the light of men. And this light, which is only possible through grace, shines in the darkness. Because darkness is works. Darkness is human nature. Darkness is a wicked problem. And this wicked problem did not comprehend it. This abounding grace is so incomprehensible to wicked human nature. So this grace logic was in the world, but the world, which was made through this logic, and the world couldn't know this logic. But as many as received this grace and truth logic, to them, God gave them the right to become children of God. Even to those who believe in this grace, truth logic, who are born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God, who is this grace logic. And this grace logic became flesh. This idea of abounding grace became flesh. And this flesh lived among us who were surrounded by darkness. And we saw this grace logic glory as the only begotten from God the Father, full of grace and truth. You exist as a church to be recipients of grace abounding. This logic, this logos, this word. And you, like Jesus, are asked to be full of grace and truth, to embody, to take on flesh. So that in the darkness, in the world where works prevails, where wickedness prevails, the wicked problem prevails, you can be a light shining in that darkness, an embodiment of something different, hinting at a solution, God's solution, which is not harsh, which isn't shame, which isn't guilt, but it's grace, abounding. Wherever sin increases, you're asked to abound with grace. Not your own, but God's grace. Would you bow your heads with me? Jesus, you are the final word of God, the final strategy, the final logic. That grace would abound where sin abounds. We're so dumb for thinking that we can sin more, that grace may abound all the more. Help us to be defeated. Help us to die. Help us to understand why Christ had to die so that we might receive grace through him. God, help this church, Logo Central Chapel, be full of grace and truth. This I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Church, receive the benediction. God, we pray to you today that we may come to know you as one full of grace and truth. In the everyday dealings that we call life, I pray that we would experience and be aware of your grace. Help us to be the loved ones, the forgiven ones, the ones pursued, the ones forgiven over and over and over again. May we learn to live in a place of trust rather than a place of works. And out of the overflow of this experience of your love that is grace, may we see others differently. May we see others as you see them. May we communicate your love to them in ways that are full of grace and truth. Thank you for this doctrine. Thank you for this truth, this strategy. May it be real in our lives. So go out full of grace and truth. In Jesus' name, amen. Happy Father's Day. Have a great day celebrating your fathers. Take care, everyone.